What if I told you that one of history's most powerful kings died in such a grotesque manner that stray dogs lapped up fluids leaking from his coffin? This isn't fiction, this isn't medieval folklore. This is the shocking, repulsive truth about the death of Henry VIII of England, a story so disturbing that historians have sanitized it for centuries. Well, buckle up, because today we're rediving deep into the medical nightmare that was his final years. And trust me, it's worse than any horror movie you've ever seen. You think you know Henry VIII, the man who defied the Pope, created his own church, and executed 2 wives. Warning, this video contains graphic descriptions of medical conditions and death. Viewer discretion is advised. I'm about to take you on a journey through one of history's most shocking transformations. We'll witness how Europe's most handsome prince became a obese tyrant whose very presence could clear a room 3 doors away. But first, let me ask you this. How does a man go from being described as having an angelic countenance, superior to any Christian prince, to becoming so grotesquely deformed that courtiers fainted at his smell? The answer lies in a single moment. One accident that changed the course of English history and transformed a Renaissance ideal into a living nightmare. Hit that subscribe button because this story gets progressively more disturbing, and you won't want to miss a single horrifying detail. Above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, his complexion very fair and bright, with auburn hair combed straight and short in the French fashion, and a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. Let's start at the beginning, because the contrast makes what comes next even more shocking. His shoulders were broad, his waist trim at just 32 inches, and he possessed the athletic prowess of an Olympic champion. He could outride, outfight, and outcharm anyone at his court. Picture this, June 28, 1491. Henry Tudor enters the world as the sparer, never meant to rule, but fate had other plans. When his older brother Arthur died suddenly in 1502, young Henry became the heir apparent to the English throne. He spoke fluent Latin, French, Spanish, and some Italian. He was a skilled archer, swordsman, and women swooned. Men envied him, and foreign kingdoms trembled at his very name. And what an heir he was. When Henry VIII ascended to the throne at just 17 years old in 1509, he was quite literally the definition of perfection. Contemporary accounts describe him as a golden god walking among mortals. Would England lose its king? Henry, now 44 but still considering himself invincible, decided to participate in the joust despite the concerns of his advisors. What started as a simple wound transformed into an open weeping ulcer that would torment him for the remaining 11 years of his life. But this wasn't just any wound. This became a gateway to hell itself. Listen to this description from a Venetian ambassador. His Majesty is the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on. The thundering of hooves, the crack of lances, the cheers of the crowd. Henry, resplendent in his armor, charges toward his opponent. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just royal flattery. Foreign diplomats had no reason to exaggerate. Henry was genuinely spectacular to behold. He stood over 6 feet tall in an age when the average man was barely 5. The king, weighed down by nearly 95 pounds of armor, disappears beneath the thrashing beast. The crowd falls silent, and Bullen screams. Henry was a Renaissance man in the truest sense. He composed music, yes, he actually wrote Greensleeves. But here's what makes this story so terrifying. In just 38 years, this golden god would transform into something so horrifying that grown men could stand to be in the same room with him. January 24, 1536. Greenwich Palace. The tournament was supposed to be a celebration of courtly splendor. What happened next would curse him for the rest of his life. Picture the scene. Thousands of spectators, including his second wife Anne Boleyn, watching from the royal box. Then disaster strikes. Henry's massive destrier, a warhorse weighing over 1,000 pounds, crashes to the ground. For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. Physicians rushed to the scene, courtiers whispered prayers, and the entire kingdom held its breath. Henry survived, but something died that day. His invincibility, his confidence, and most importantly, his health. The injury to his right leg would never heal properly. Here is what the medical experts won't tell you. Modern analysis suggests Henry suffered what we now call compartment syndrome. The crushing weight of his horse caused massive internal damage, destroying blood vessels and creating the perfect environment for chronic infection. And here's the truly disturbing part. Some historians believe Henry also suffered a traumatic brain injury during this accident. The Golden Prince was becoming a monster, and his body was beginning to rot from the inside out. The behavioral changes that followed, increased paranoia, explosive rage, and erratic decision-making all aligned with symptoms of frontal lobe damage. Coincidence or not, it was just 4 months after this accident that Henry ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn on fabricated charges of adultery and treason. Now we enter the truly disturbing part of our story. That leg wound, initially dismissed by royal physicians as a minor inconvenience, began to fester, and I mean that literally. The ulcer would close temporarily, giving false hope, then burst open again, releasing torrents of pus and blood. Physicians, operating under medieval understanding of anatomy and infection, applied treatments that would make your skin crawl. The smell was indescribable. Contemporary accounts describe it as a mixture of rotting meat, sulfur, and something even worse. Something that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Immediately, the king is coming, and you must stand there, smile, bow respectfully, and pretend that nothing is wrong. Soon courtiers reported that they could actually see bone through the decomposing flesh. His famous 32-inch waist began to expand at an alarming rate. Any sign of revulsion could be interpreted as an insult to royal dignity, punishable by death. Courtiers began to recognize the king's approach not by his footsteps or his voice, but by the nauseating stench that preceded him. Henry's daily caloric intake reached approximately 5,000 calories, nearly double what an active adult male needs today. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the quality of what he consumed. Imagine being a courtier at Hampton Court Palace. You're re-walking down a corridor when suddenly you're re-hit by a wave of putrid air so overwhelming that your stomach lurches. His waist had expanded from 32 inches to over 50 inches. His weight had ballooned from a fit 180 pounds to well over 300 pounds. His face, once angelically beautiful, had become bloated and red. The medical treatments of the time only made things worse. The infection was so severe that witnesses reported seeing white bone protruding through blackened, putrefied flesh. The smell had become so overwhelming that it could be detected 3 rooms away from wherever the king was located. In an age when scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies were common, Henry managed to avoid these diseases through sheer excess. But he was creating far worse problems for himself. The royal physicians discovered that the wounds were being infested with maggots. Rather than seeing this as a sign of decay, they actually believed the maggots were helping to clean the wounds. The charming, charismatic young king had been replaced by a paranoid tyrant who saw conspiracies everywhere. His legendary temper, always quick to flare, became explosive and unpredictable. So Henry VIII, King of England and defender of the faith, walked around with living insects feeding on his rotting flesh. Surrey's crime, writing poetry that Henry interpreted as treason. The Earl was beheaded just 9 days before the king's own death. Hot iron cauterization. They literally burned the wound with red-hot metal, believing this would purify the infection. Not only did he order her execution, but he also had her alleged lover tortured to death in the most brutal manner possible. Nobles carried perfumed handkerchiefs to cover their noses when in the royal presence. Servants fought over assignments that would keep them away from the king. Foreign ambassadors began finding excuses to avoid formal audiences. The king's jealousy had become homicidal. Mercury and arsenic applications. These toxic substances were applied directly to the open flesh. Regular bloodletting, already weakened by infection. Henry was further drained through deliberate blood loss. To put this in perspective, he was so obese that doorways in his palaces had to be widened just to accommodate his bulk. His marriage to 19-year-old Catherine Howard when he was 49 was particularly disturbing. Imagine this teenage girl, forced to share a bed with a man whose body was literally whose breath reeked of infection, and whose touch left stains on everything he contacted. A specially designed pulley system was installed to move him between floors, operated by teams of servants. Poultices containing ground pearls, unicorn horn powder, and other precious substances that did absolutely nothing except waste money. Each treatment made the condition worse. The wound grew deeper, wider, more infected. But the physical horror was just the beginning. With reduced mobility due to his leg injury, Henry began eating more and moving less. The royal kitchen records tell a story of gluttony that defies belief. Breakfast: multiple meat pies, joints of beef, gallons of ale; dinner: swan, peacock, venison, more beef, fish courses, and rivers of wine; supper, yet more meat, cheese, fruits preserved in sugar, and additional alcohol. Vegetables were almost entirely absent from his diet. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry's transformation was shocking, but the worst was yet to come. By 1543, Henry VIII had become something that barely resembled a human being. His weight had reached an estimated 400 pounds, nearly 30 stone in British measurement. The leg ulcers had multiplied. What started as a single wound had spread to both legs. Here is a detail that will haunt your dreams, but the physical horror was matched by psychological deterioration that was equally terrifying. The head injury from his jousting accident had fundamentally altered Henry's personality. Consider this chilling example. In 1546, just months before his death, Henry ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a man who had served the crown faithfully for years. Henry's paranoia about poisoning reached obsessive levels. Every meal required an elaborate security protocol. Multiple food tasters had to sample each dish. All utensils were inspected for poison. Servants had to swear oaths before preparing food. Even water had to be tested before the king would drink it. His behavior toward women became equally disturbing. Despite his grotesque physical condition, Henry continued to pursue young wives. When Catherine inevitably sought comfort elsewhere, Henry's rage was beyond comprehension. The court itself had transformed into a place of whispered terror. But nature wasn't finished with Henry VIII yet. The worst was still to come. The winter of 1546-47 brought Henry VIII to depths of suffering that seem almost impossible to imagine. By this point, gangrene had set in both legs. For those who don't know, gangrene is the death of body tissue due to lack of blood flow or bacterial infection. In Henry's case, it was both. His legs were literally decomposing while he was still alive. The smell had become so unbearable that even the most loyal courtiers couldn't hide their revulsion. One contemporary account describes how visitors to the royal chambers would vomit upon entering. The odor was described as the breath of hell itself, a mixture of rotting flesh, infected pus, and something indescribably worse. He also suspected his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, of heresy, and came dangerously close to ordering her execution as well. Only Catherine's quick thinking and desperate flattery saved her from the fate of her predecessors. The royal physicians, either through ignorance or desperation, continued to apply increasingly bizarre remedies. Henry's eating habits had become even more grotesque. Despite his obvious illness, his appetite remained voracious. He would alternate between begging for her forgiveness and screaming accusations at empty air. Courtiers were forced to stand and watch their king arguing with invisible phantoms, while the stench of his decomposing body filled the room. But now, everything he ate seemed to feed the infection rather than nourish his body. During his final months, Henry experienced frequent episodes of delirium. The man who had redefined Christianity in England, who had executed anyone who dared oppose him, who had wielded absolute power over millions of lives, was reduced to a rotting hulk that could barely speak above a whisper. Witnesses reported that during these fits, he would scream the names of his dead wives, particularly Anne Boleyn, whom he had executed 11 years earlier. His bloated form continued to expand while his extremities rotted away. He had to be carried everywhere in a specially constructed chair, operated by a team of 8 men. Even as Henry lay dying, surrounded by the overwhelming stench of his own decomposition, courtiers and physicians had to maintain the pretense that recovery was possible. Pus and blood leaked constantly from his wounds. His eyes had become glassy and his massive body had begun to shut down in the most grotesque manner possible. He developed a high fever that caused violent shaking fits. His bloated body would alternately burn with fever and shake with chills. When he needed to relieve himself, servants had to physically lift and position his massive, rotting body. The king, unable to speak, squeezed the archbishop's hand with what little strength remained in his rotting body. Witnesses reported that Henry would suddenly scream in terror, clawing at invisible attackers. He was 55 years old and had reigned for 37 years, 9 months, and 6 days. Unable to speak above a whisper, he gestured for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to be summoned. When Cranmer arrived, he found the king barely conscious, his massive body racked with infection. He would beg for mercy from people who weren't there, then turn violent and try to strike out at his phantom. The psychological torture was equally severe. Servants reported that the odor clung to their clothes even after leaving the royal presence. Some claimed they could taste it in their food hours later. The very air around Henry had become toxic. Here's one of the most disturbing accounts. During one delirious episode in December 1546, Henry apparently carried on entire conversations with Anne Boleyn's ghost. His paranoia reached insane levels. Henry became convinced that his own son, the future Edward VI, was plotting against him. The physical indignities were beyond comprehension. Henry could no longer walk, even with assistance. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the treatments that continued right up until his death. Live leeches were applied to drain bad blood. Imagine, hundreds of these creatures covering his infected wounds. Heated pokers were used to cauterize new areas. As the infection spread ground, human skull was mixed into poultices. They actually used powdered human bone as medicine. Fresh urine from young virgin girls was applied as a purifying wash. None of these treatments helped. They only added to his agony. By January 1547, something extraordinary happened. The king, who had terrified an entire nation for nearly 4 decades, had become something that inspired only pity and revulsion. But his suffering wasn't over yet. January 1547, the end was approaching, and everyone knew it. Except, legally, no one could say so. Here's something that will blow your mind. Under English law, it was actually treason to predict the death of the monarch. Can you imagine the psychological torture? Everyone could see that the king was dying. His breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. But no one, absolutely no one, could acknowledge what was obvious to everyone. The smell had become so overwhelming that it permeated the entire wing of the palace. During his final weeks, Henry experienced what modern doctors would recognize as septic shock. His infected wounds were literally poisoning his blood. The hallucinations became more frequent and more terrifying. On January 27, 1547, Henry finally accepted reality. This is the moment that still gives historians chills. Christian faith and trusted in Christ for salvation. That hand squeeze was Henry VIII's last conscious act. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, at Whitehall Palace, the most feared monarch in English history finally exhaled his last, rattling breath. But here's the truly horrifying part. His ordeal wasn't over. What happened after Henry's death is so disturbing that most history books skip over it entirely. The moment Henry died, his courtiers faced an immediate problem. What do you do with a 400-pound corpse that has been rotting from the inside for over a decade? The royal embalmers were called in, but they faced a challenge unlike anything in their experience. Medieval embalming was primitive at best, essentially removing internal organs and stuffing the body cavities with aromatic herbs and spices. When they attempted to remove his internal organs, the embalmers discovered that many were already liquefied by infection. But here's where the story takes its most macabre turn. A turn so disturbing that it is rarely mentioned even in scholarly accounts. What should have been solid tissue had become a putrid soup of decay. But Henry's body was so infected, so decomposed, that traditional methods were useless. Here is a detail that will make your skin crawl. A special coffin had to be constructed just to contain his massive corrupted remains. The body of Henry VIII, the man who had declared himself head of the Church of England, who had claimed divine authority over his subjects' souls, was literally leaking from his coffin. During the night, according to contemporary cadaveric fluid, essentially liquid decomposition, seeped through the inadequate seals and dripped onto the chapel floor. Despite the overwhelming stench that emanated from the sealed coffin, the ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a monarch, and executed another. Reigned for just 6 years before dying of illness at age 15. Henry was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him the son he desperately wanted. Think about that for a moment. Henry's jousting injury created the perfect environment for bacteria to invade his leg bone, causing continuous infection that never healed, and countless others to their deaths ended up as dog food on a chapel floor. In the 16th century, this was essentially a death sentence. But it gets worse. The coffin was placed in the chapel at Sion Abbey, while arrangements were made for the state funeral. While disputed by many historians, some evidence suggests Henry may have contracted syphilis, which in its final stages can cause neurological symptoms, personality changes, and the kind of chronic wounds that plagued his final years. The transformation from golden prince to rotting tyrant took just 11 years, a decline so rapid and so complete that it seems almost supernatural in its awfulness. And then came the ultimate humiliation. Stray dogs broke into the chapel and lapped up the putrid liquid that had leaked from their former king's corpse. They were supposed to be chosen by God, blessed with superhuman qualities, and protected by heavenly favor. The grotesque decline and death of Henry VIII shattered this illusion completely. This would explain not just his physical transformation, but his increasingly erratic and violent behavior. The mighty Henry VIII, who had lived like a god among mortals, died like the most wretched beggar, his rotting flesh consumed by street animals. And yet, he died in the most degrading manner possible, his body rotting while he still lived, his remains consumed by stray dogs. Imagine being told your entire life that your king was appointed by God, only to witness him dying in a pool of his own putrefied flesh. It must have shaken the very foundations of how people understood power, authority, and divine will. The man who rewrote the laws of his kingdom to satisfy his desires could not rewrite the laws of biology. In the end, bacteria and decay proved more powerful than any crown. His final symptoms, difficulty breathing, fluid retention, and general weakness, all suggest his heart was failing. Rich or poor, king or peasant, powerful or powerless, death comes for everyone. The king who had demanded absolute reverence ended up as food for stray dogs. The monarch who had claimed divine authority was reduced to a rotting hulk that cleared rooms with its stench. And sometimes, as in Henry's case, it comes in ways that strip away every pretense of dignity and grandeur. And remember that no one, absolutely no one, is immune to the fundamental fragility of human existence. In just 11 years, Henry went from being Europe's most admired prince to something that inspired only revulsion and pity. Henry's transformation wasn't just physical, it was moral and psychological. As his body rotted, so did his soul. The handsome prince who had once been praised for his justice and wisdom became a paranoid tyrant who murdered his own wives. No one, no matter how powerful or protected they seem, is immune to the reversal of fortune. No matter how high we rise, no matter how much power we accumulate, no matter how invincible we believe ourselves to be, we all face the same final enemy. Let that image sink in. The man who had terrorized a nation, who had redefined Christianity in England, who had sent 2 wives to the block. His son Edward died young, and England's golden age came through his daughters, particularly Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman he had executed on false charges. The woman Henry accused of adultery and treason, whose head he ordered severed from her body, gave birth to the daughter who would make England the most powerful nation on earth, and Boleyn's daughter became one of history's greatest monarchs, while Henry's precious son died young and forgotten. The symbolism is so perfect it seems almost fictional, but multiple contemporary sources record this incident. The funeral finally took place on February 16, 1547, nearly 3 weeks after his death. The irony is crushing. Edward VI, The son for whom Henry had broken with Rome divorced one wife. So what actually killed Henry VIII? Modern medical analysis provides some disturbing answers. Based on contemporary accounts and symptoms, medical historians believe Henry suffered from multiple conditions that created a perfect storm of horror. First, chronic astma. Second, type 2 diabetes. His excessive weight gain, constant thirst, and slow-healing wounds all point to severe diabetes. Third, congestive heart failure. His massive weight gain put enormous strain on his cardiovascular system. Fourth, chronic kidney disease. The constant infections in his body likely damaged his kidneys, explaining his final decline. But here is the most disturbing theory. Some medical historians believe Henry also suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that can cause dramatic personality changes, weight gain, and poor wound healing. There's also the syphilis theory. Whatever the exact cause, one thing is certain: Henry VIII died one of the most horrific deaths in recorded history. The death of Henry VIII marked more than just the end of a king. It symbolized the death of the medieval concept of divine monarchy. For centuries, kings had claimed to rule by divine right. Here was a king who had claimed authority over the very souls of his subjects, who had declared himself head of the church, who had demanded absolute obedience as God's representative on earth. The psychological impact on his subjects must have been enormous. But perhaps the most profound irony is this: Henry's desperate quest for a male heir, the driving force behind his break with Rome. His multiple marriages and his countless executions ultimately failed. Think about that. The reversal is so complete it seems like divine justice. So what can we learn from the horrific death of Henry VIII? First, it is a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, cannot overcome the fundamental limitations of human flesh. Second, it shows us how quickly fortune can change. Third, it's a perfect example of how unchecked power corrupts absolutely. But perhaps, most importantly, Henry's death reminds us that we're all equal in the face of mortality. The man who had lived like a god died like an animal. In the end, Henry VIII's death stands as one of history's most powerful reminders of human mortality. And sometimes, that enemy wins in ways more horrible than we could ever imagine. If this story has taught you anything, it should be to appreciate your health. Question absolute power. What do you think? Was Henry's horrific end divine justice for his crimes, or simply the cruel randomness of biology? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing deaths, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. Until next time, remember, power fades, crowns crumble, but the truth endures forever.